Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and round 3 of the 2025 fantasy season is now behind us. Collingwood and Sydney sat out the round and we saw 4 sides remain unbeaten. Curiously though, we have the Hawks, who have played 4 times, Crows and Lions 3 times, and the Suns 2 times, and they're all undefeated. It's a weird ladder, and it'll look that way for most of the season. But onto the fantasy side of things, and as usual, there were plenty of discussion points from the round, including Chris Scott at Geelong, up to his old tricks with the late withdrawal of Tom Stewart, and then the audacity to put Nevitt as the sub, just to stick the brood finger up at the fantasy community once again. Now, as we approach round 4, something exciting for those who play on the new Keeper Fantasy platform. And if you're in a league who have elected to use the Keeper-specific DPPs, then you're going to get your first set of DPP changes this week to be announced on Wednesday. If you hadn't had a chance, go and check out a video that the coaches panel dropped going through all the potential DPP changes that we are likely to see. And yeah, get ready to jump on any players with new relevance. But for those playing with the traditional DPPs that are in line with AFL Fantasy, Supercoach, Real Dream Team, we've still got a few weeks before we see any changes there. So I'm going to make a change to one of the segments on this podcast. It's not a huge change, it's really just a name change. The first segment, which was called Notable Role Changes, I just want to open that up a little bit so that I can talk about more than just role changes. Now, I haven't thought of a catchy name for it yet, so I'm just going to go with Things I've Noticed to keep it nice and general. And I'll get started for the things I noticed in round 3. Starting on Thursday night, I was very excited to see Saad El-Hawley was named to debut for the Bombers. Put a tweet out, quite excited about it. But in this current generation, we are so used to seeing the excitement of a debutant then being dampened by the fact that he's in the sub-vest, which is what happened with El-Hawley. But he came on in the last quarter, and he gave the Bombers a real spike, a little shot of energy, which is just what they needed. He had 7 touches, no marks, no tackles, just got the pill 7 times, ran and created, and it helped the Bombers on their way to a very much needed victory over Port Adelaide. In the same game, Dylan Shield was someone, we've looked at since pre-season as having that halfback role, and last week talked about how, yes, he's got the role, but it doesn't appear to be working. So this was going to be really interesting to see what Essendon did with him this week. Does he continue in that role? Does he get moved? Does he get dropped to the VFL? In the end, he went straight into the middle, which is probably his best position still, even in his older years. And he had a pretty good game. I thought he was better for the Bombers than he had been off half-back. The knock-on effect of this, though, was quite frustrating for those waiting to see if Ben Hobbs is ever going to get there, because Elijah Sardis was out with a broken finger, and that made me think, this is Hobbs' chance to get some real midfield time and show what he can do, like he did in the pre-season game against Geelong. But it was Dylan Shield who took that spot, and we saw Hobbs pretty much playing that same role off half forward and not really having a big game. Also in the game, we saw Jason Burgoyne have an absolute ripper, and he appeared to be off half-back, which is something that owners would have been wanting for him and would have been frustrated that he lost his defender status, but it looked like that's where he was on Thursday night. And he was up and down the wings, had a huge game. So hopefully, if you're a Burgoyne owner, that continues and he may pick up defender status once again. Because as a mid only, he's handy. As a defender, he's really valuable. And then finally from that game, speaking of the Port Adelaide wing, Christian Moraes, in his second game, came on as a sub last week, and this was his first full game, playing on the wing, and he absolutely killed it. He was everywhere, 27 touches, and looks like a really good player. So if he can keep that spot on the wing and Burgoyne can stay at half back, I think it's going to be very good for both those players' fantasy prospects. On to Friday night, and we saw a performance that has earned this guy the Finders Keepers Player of the Week, and that is Sam Davidson. Woo! What a game. He absolutely loved the wings of Marvel. 31 touches, 10 marks, and we talked about it last week with his hard running and just the look. I was watching him last week, and even though the scoring wasn't there, you could just see that this guy is going to be good for footy, good for the Bulldogs and good for fantasy. So very exciting to see that performance from him. He's probably not going to do that every week, sure, but to know he's got that ceiling in just his third AFL game is very exciting indeed. In the same game was Jack Silvani. Really interesting. I feel like we've spoken about him a bit this year. We know that he had that defensive role pegged for the start of the year, and we've seen him sort of chop and change in the first two games. But once I saw Mackay was going to miss again, I thought, well, that's probably the end of Silvani as a defender. He has to go forward. But he played in the back line on Norton, completely shut him out of the game, and he looked great. He even took a kick in. I think he took 9 marks, scored pretty well, and I just think he's really turning into someone that's going to be reliable with a high floor, because I think in that role, even if he's not getting a huge amount of the ball, he's still going to be able to get up to a 60 at least. So very good from Silvani. Good to see him playing good footy too. We know he's had a lot of injuries over the journey. Another Carlton player, Brodie Kemp, just really impressive as a forward. I mean, he kicked 5 goals, and obviously his score was fantastic as a result. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a consistent scoring line for him, but just as an observation, he looks like a really good player forward for the Blues. And just on that, Lewis Young as well. I mean, he's copped so much in his career as a defender. He looked much more comfortable as a forward. So Carlton are really interesting. They're obviously 0-3, and the fans aren't happy, and I really feel for them. I felt like they were going to get the win against the Doggies. They looked good early, and once again, it just didn't work out. So I think there's going to be a fair bit of change and uncertainty in most Carlton players, but those guys I just mentioned, those new roles are looking pretty good, I reckon. On to Saturday, and we saw Bailey Humphrey for Gold Coast. Is this a third-year breakout we are about to see? He's the sort of player that we've been waiting on, and I think impatiently. I mean, to think he's only in his third year, I feel like he's been around a lot longer than that. Anyway, he just look at home in the midfield. He's not going to be a permanent mid, just yet, but when he's getting his moments in there at the moment, his opportunities in there, he is taking them, and it's pretty exciting for a guy who still has forward status, and he could still be floating around in some leagues. You never know. Have a look for him. Took Miller is playing more of a forward role, and I guess unlike, say, Stephen Cornelio, he's still scoring really well. Now, his CBAs are still there, so they're still using him in the midfield, but you can really see what Gold Coast are doing with Miller. They're going to start to transition him to a forward role, and it's looking really good, and he's scoring really well still. So I'm expecting, and I guess hoping for owners, that he's going to get that forward status in a few weeks' time, and that's going to make him one of the better forwards you're going to be able to get your hands on. Xavier Lindsay, that looked like it being a heartbreak story. He started at half back, looked good from the get-go, and then went down with the knee injury. Thank goodness that those scans have come back really positive. There's no serious damage done. And I even saw or heard on the radio, he's even a small chance to play this week, which is crazy when you think about it. Seems unlikely, but it's great news that he's not going to be out, at least for long term. But with him out, we sort of had a bit of a closer look at his teammate, Harvey Langford, who's another one of these young Ds picked up in the draft that the fantasy world has been very keen on. And Langford, I think owners of Langford would have been a bit, not frustrated, but, he was the sub in the first game and then he was dropped. So I think we've just been waiting to see it, and, we didn't have to wait long. He got a full game on the weekend, 55% of the CBAs, and he just looked great. 26 touches, and, I think there's been a bit of commentary about this already, but Melbourne, the question's going to be asked, where are they at? Where's their list at? Is it time to just start to move some of those older guys out the way and just hand the keys of the midfield to the likes of Rivers, Langford, and the other guys coming through? So Melbourne are an interesting watch for the next little bit. They need to get a win on the board, that's for sure. Hugo Garcia for St Kilda, with his forward status, was a pretty hyped up player in the preseason. It looked like he was going to get a lot of midfield time. And the first couple of weeks didn't really go to plan, and I think it was last week he was named the sub. So Garcia owners would have been getting a little bit frustrated early days. Hopefully, if you were one, you didn't let him go, because on the weekend he pretty much put a statement to the St Kilda coaching committee to say, don't you ever make me sub again. He was huge, especially in that first quarter. Plenty of CBAs and, laid 9 tackles, 23 touches, a really good game from him. It was interesting to see the CBAs for St Kilda because Jack Steele was a late out with a knee soreness, I think it was. And it was Garcia who very much stepped in and took up a lot of the CBAs, as well as Zach Jones. So next week, hopefully Jack Steele's back, and then it'll be just an interesting watch. But I think Garcia played so well, he is likely to keep that spot moving forward. Actually, something else that was interesting was Jack Sinclair. I thought that with Steele out, he'd be a likely candidate to go into the middle, and he played pretty much completely off halfback and, absolutely dominated. So, again, hard to see too much of that changing for this week. Caminiti continued his new defensive role and did well again. Took another 9 marks, scored pretty well. So if he's someone you jumped on last week, you would have been pretty pleased with that. Just a bit on Richmond's back half. Nick Vlauston went forward in the second half. Obviously, they're just trying a few different things, but certainly not what you want to see if you're a Vlauston owner. And we talked last week about how Ben Miller took so many of their kick-ins instead of Short. That didn't continue. Short was the main guy this week. Not by much, but it certainly reverted back to how it was, and Short scored pretty well accordingly. On to the Saturday night games. We had Brisbane take on Geelong. And I want to talk about Sam De Koning. He's been a very much spoken about player, that's for sure. And there was some concern with the Cats heading into these tougher fixtures against Brisbane and now Melbourne next week. So some would have been excited when big Oscar McInerney was laid out. But I wasn't that excited about it because Darcy Fort, he's no chump. And I knew it was going to be just as much a battle for De Koning. So the role was the same for him. We saw Blitzarves end up doing a bit more rucking than we thought because De Koning was subbed in the last quarter. And it was put down as tactical, but he did cop a knock in the third quarter, so I'm wondering if there's any connection there. As an owner, I'm hoping that was the case, but yeah, it's going to be an interesting watch because he's up against Max Gawn this week, and Reece Stanley looked pretty good in the VFL, so I feel like we've said this every week about De Koning, but it is a nervy sort of period for owners, so we'll see what the Cats do at the selection table this week. And then just lastly on the Cats, the decision to put Mitch Nevitt as the sub. Sometimes in the fantasy community we can get pretty silly and frustrated at coaches because they haven't done the right thing by our fantasy sides. And clearly with the amount of people that brought Nevitt in the salary cap formats, as well as keeper owners, it was pretty frustrating. I thought he'd done enough to get 4 quarters. It looked like a game that would suit him, his size, a big-bodied mid in the wet up against Brisbane. But for whatever reason, he was the sub. So came on in the last quarter, did some nice things. I'd be surprised if he was the sub again. But with Geelong, we really just don't know until we know, right? The other Saturday night game was Hawks and Giants. Didn't take too much out of this one, but just an observation on Cam McKenzie for the Hawks. Just continues to improve every week. He's looking like a very good player to own. It's interesting to see, though, James Worpel isn't going to be far away. I don't know if he's back. They've got the bye this week. So, yeah, he could be back next week. Just going to be so interested to see what happens to that CBA split, because right now it is Day, Nash and Newcomb, and then bits and pieces with, mostly McKenzie, but little bits of Ward and Dylan Moore. I just wonder what happens when Worpel returns. It's going to be a very interesting watch. On to Sunday and my Crows, who just keep on going. It's been a great start to the season for them. Just one player I noticed was James Peatling played his best game as a Crow. And interestingly, it was with less CBAs. So he was a bit more off half forward than previous weeks and yet had his best game. So it's probably more just that he's 3 weeks in to learning a new system. But I just thought that was interesting that he played really well in that role, because I think it'll continue and I think he will pick up forward status, which is going to be so handy for anyone owning him. The other guy was Isaac Rankin, just had the biggest game he's had in terms of midfield minutes, 70% of the CBAs, and dominated. Looks really good in there. It's just a matter of time before the tags come his way. In the derby, we saw Ryan Marrick for West Coast put in a great game, in a fantasy sense anyway. He's been a great little watch the last few weeks. In round 1, he was the sub, but he came on, took kick-ins. Last week, he took plenty of kick-ins, played 4 quarters in that role. And then on the weekend against Freo, he was huge. He took 9 kick-ins, and the next best for West Coast was 2. The other good thing is, not good thing, but McGovern looked a bit proppy at the end of the game, and I guess there's a chance he'll miss. If he does, that's only going to open up the opportunity for Marrick even more. I don't think it matters, though. I think that role's going to stick for the time being. And with the forward status, yeah, he's an exciting guy to have, I reckon. Neil Erasmus is a guy that I don't know where it is. I'm just willing him to succeed. I really want him to succeed because I have him in both keepers I'm in, but I don't know. I just feel like a couple of years ago it looked like he was going to be something, and it's been a rough couple of years for him. But you can really safely say he's getting the opportunities. He's getting the midfield time. He hasn't been the sub, and he's building. He's getting there. I don't know what Freo fans think of him, but I hope they persevere with him. One thing, though, and this is clearly what he's got to get out of his game, is he went statless in the third quarter. Didn't touch it at all. Now, I looked at how much time he was on the ground. He had 54% time on ground, so obviously he was off a lot of that third quarter. But he can't be statless in a quarter. And, for a guy who's just playing for his spot, playing for his career just about, yeah, I hope he gets that out of his system, because he'll be back in the waffle before we know it. And then the last one, Nathan O'Driscoll, who's having a really good few rounds to start the year. I just wanted to comment on him because he's clearly got the wing role. The inside game isn't going to be for him at this stage. But it's a really friendly wing role, and I think we're starting to see more friendly wing roles throughout the comp. And I think with O'Driscoll, it comes down to him starting at the wing, but then attending a lot of the stoppages throughout the game. So starting outside the centre bounce, but kind of following the ball around and then using his engine to get out and open and collect those plus sixes. So, yeah, Freo have got a great player there. And those are the things I noticed in round 3. What did you notice from the round that just went? Let me know. Drop me a comment on X at FindKeepAFL. And also, you can find this podcast on YouTube as well. So feel free to drop a comment on the YouTube page. Let me know what you think. Is there something else that I've missed that's happening right now? A player that has a different role or a trend that you're noticing? Let me know. The Keeper League community sees this stuff much better than any other. All right, let's have a look at my top waiver wire picks for this week. Don't have a huge list, and some of these names, I don't know, maybe they're already owned, but there's 6 names I wanted to look at, and if they are available, make sure you're putting in a waiver pick for them. The first one, we talked about him before, Ryan Marrick from West Coast. He's 20 years old. He's got forward status. He's playing off halfback. He's a great guy to pick up. The other one is John Noble, the ex-Magpie, who's just played his second game at second game at Gold Coast. And, yeah, looked every bit what you would have been hoping if you drafted him. Huge score. I just think he may still be floating around in some pools. Hugo Garcia, same thing. The chances are he's not available, but gee, I reckon there'd be coaches who may have dropped him after being the sub last week. Christian Moraes for Port Adelaide in his second game, absolutely killed it on the wing. Another guy to definitely just jump on, and don't know whether or not you'd trust him on field. I mean, I don't see why not after the weekend, but yeah, I guess we can't get too excited over one game, but I certainly liked what I saw. On the other end of the scale, a guy in the twilight years, Camden McIntosh for Richmond. His CBAs and his midfield role was, expected and talked about in pre-season and the first few rounds, but it's sort of been his tagging role that's been interesting. So he's following the best player, and that means he's close to the ball. He's 30 years old, but worth grabbing, having him as your last mid. And, this could end up being one of his best fantasy years in one of his last AFL seasons, which you don't see that too often. And the last player I put on here, just because his side had the bye and he had a couple of really good games, but, when a player has a couple of good games and then they've got the bye, it's not often you put in a waiver pick for him. Anyway, it's Lachie Schultz at Collingwood, who... yeah, I just think he's starting to put it together as a Collingwood player, and his scoring is suggesting that as well. So another handy forward that could be available and people might just forget about, because a lot of people will put, when they go to the pool, they'll look at who scored the most last round, and obviously Collingwood and Sydney players scored nothing last round. So have a look for Schultz, grab him if he's there. On to the listener questions this week, and only a couple this week, and I really want to put the call out. If you're listening to this podcast and you're enjoying it, I want you to jump onto X, find at FindKeepAFL, and leave a comment or a question with the best trade you've ever seen in a keeper league. It could be a trade that you pulled off and completely hoodwinked a mate, or it could be one you've just witnessed in a league you're in. Whatever the case, send them in. I want to hear some really good trade stories, especially those ones that involve draft picks and what you use that draft pick on, because that's often forgotten when we do trading in keeper leagues. Yeah, picks go flying left, right and centre. But what do you actually use the picks on, and do they end up remaining in your side long term? So let me know, and if you're not on X, that's fine. We're also on YouTube. Finders Keepers page is on YouTube, and you can leave a comment on any of the episodes. So leave a comment on this one if you're listening on there right now. The best trades or trades you've ever seen in a keeper league. And as well as usual, send in any keeper-related questions, such as what Hawker at Hawker's Heroes on X has sent through a couple of questions for me. Hawker's a great follower of the pod and great follower of Coach's Panel, and love your work, Hawker. Thanks for writing in. He has written, Rao now looking like the player he burst onto the scene as an observation. And I couldn't agree more. I felt this way 12 months ago when Rao had a good couple of rounds and then he kind of petered off. But I guess the thing with Rao from a footy perspective, but from a fantasy perspective as well, is he's always been an inside beast, and we know he's always going to get a heap of contested footy, lots of tackles. It's that ability to spread and get the easy marks, those uncontested marks on the outside, that's going to be what contributes to his fantasy scoring going really high and staying high. And we saw that on the weekend. He absolutely destroyed the Melbourne midfield, and I really hope he goes on from Rao. I feel like we've been waiting for years for him and the Suns, in a sense, to really break out and show what they can do. I think it's going to happen finally for Rao and for the Suns. Just hopefully not this weekend against the Crows. Hawker also says, do you think Windsor gets a mid-roll when he comes back in for the Demons, or will it be at half-back? That's a great question, and I guess it goes back to the point I made earlier in the episode about Melbourne sort of needing to work out where they are and what they're going to do moving forward. They sit at 0-3. At this point, finals seem a million miles away. So do you start putting those young guys into the midfield spots and giving them the exposure now? With Windsor, I think he's still on the wing when he comes back. They liked Lindsay at half-back. They gave him a go there on the weekend before the injury. They've got a lot of guys that can rotate through half-back and on ball. Salem, Rivers. I wouldn't be surprised if Windsor joined that rotation at some point. I'm just not sure if it's going to be this year or just yet. I hope it is, but I think he's still got plenty of development to go on the wing. Down the track, though, Hawker, I do think Windsor becomes a bit like Darcy Wilson at St Kilda. He's an outside guy to start, but I do think he ends up as, right in the guts. Hawker also asked, what position do you think Weddle sits in? Josh Weddle, talked about him in pre-season and made the point that I don't know where he lands in terms of his role and where he'll be long-term, because he's just such an all-rounder. He's got the height to play key position. He's got the agility to play more of a dashing role. I think at the moment he still just resides in the back line. I know that Hawthorn's forward line is going to be something to watch over the next 12 to 18 months, how it develops. I mean, they've got the small forwards. They just need the big targets to bring it to ground. So Weddle could end up playing forward, but at the moment I think he's fine where he is, and I don't see them needing to change that. And that role is, key position in the back line with the ability to intercept and roll up to a wing as well. He's an interesting watch. I just think wherever he lands, he's going to be a really good player. And I guess it's going to depend where he lands on whether or not he's a really good fantasy player, but I just feel like wherever he goes, he will eventually be a fantasy gun for us. So thanks for your thoughts there, Hawker. Some good questions. And as I said before, please continue to send them in. And also send in any feedback for the show. Anything you want to see different, anything you want to see added. Because at the end of the day, the more I hear from you, the listener, the more I can create this podcast to be exactly what you want it to be. And that's it for another episode of Finders Keepers. Apologies if my voice has sounded a little more nasally than usual. I've been battling the dreaded man flu this weekend, And yeah, hopefully it clears in the next couple of days. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you are enjoying what you're hearing, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening. And come find the page on X at FindKeepAFL and give the page a like, and you'll be able to stay up to date with the latest on the podcast. Have a good week. Good luck with your waiver wire picks. Good luck with your decision making heading into round 4. I hope you have a great round. All your teams get up. And don't forget, this week, Keeper Fantasy Platform will be announcing the new DPP changes if your league has opted to use them this year. In the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.